Hey guys, JJ here. We are back on the Rebel, and today we're going to talk about why motorcycles stall. Now, I'm sure a lot of you guys will already know this, but this video is for those who don't, because I too only very recently figured this out. Because I never had to before. I've been riding for a while, and I just figured out how to ride without knowing why it stalls. So, like nearly everyone I know who rides, I too learned to give it gas while releasing the clutch by trial and error, and I put that down to muscle memory. Having learned how, I have never needed to know why. I just know if I do it improperly, the bike will stall. The funny thing is, I know how engines work, I know how clutches work, I know how transmissions work, yet still I haven't made that connection on why motorcycles stall until recently. Because it's not something that I needed to know. But having said that, figuring it out, I believe, has already made me a better rider. So let's get started. How do clutches work? The clutch works as a point of disconnection, if you will, between the crankshaft and the transmission. This is going to be a very oversimplified description of how it works, but it's basically pressed up against the crank, and the rotation from the crank is transmitted through it to the transmission through friction. Now at rest, a clutch would always be engaged, and what we are doing with the lever by pulling it in is actually disengaging it. So to clear up any confusion, we're just gonna always refer to the clutch with what is happening at the lever. So pulling in the clutch would be disengaging it, and releasing it would be engaging it. So going back, the clutch works as a point of disconnection from the crank to the transmission. So you have a point of disconnect where you can stop the transmission of power to the gears. That is important when you are shifting gears, and in our case when we are taking off. So if we do the gas to clutch thing wrong while taking off, why do bikes stall? I always assume that is something else going on under there that I didn't know about yet, but it's way simpler than that, and it has to do with what happens afterwards. Where does the power from the engine ultimately go? That's right, the rear wheel. So the power goes from the piston to the crank, through the clutch, by friction, through the transmission to the rear wheel, and that's the key. So let's demonstrate. So we start the bike and it's in neutral. That's a gear where the power isn't transmitted. So we pull in the clutch and pop it into first, and if we let go of the clutch without giving any gas, it stalls. That's because all that power goes down the line to the rear wheel. And the rear wheel isn't freely moving. It's been weighed down. It's been weighed down by the weight of the bike and the weight of the rider. So all that power is getting held at that point, and that in turn stalls the whole engine. So now that we know that, check this out. I'm gonna do the same thing, dump the clutch without giving any gas, but this time I'm gonna first push the bike with my legs and get a running start. I dump the clutch with no gas, and we can see the bike is moving along. So that shows that the idling speed of the engine is enough to get the bike moving along, as long as it's already moving, as long as the initial forces of the bike being weighed down is overcome. So what we want to find is that sweet spot where the wheel will start turning without the engine stalling. So if you give it too much gas and let go of the clutch, you will take off, but you will lurch forward. You might even wheelie and hurt yourself. We don't want that. And as you already seen, if you don't give it enough gas, the bike will stall. So how do you find that balance? You want to find the point where the clutch just barely starts making contact with the crank. So the crank is moving the clutch bit by bit, so that power is getting transmitted to the wheel bit by bit, so the whole thing doesn't bind and stall the engine. So if we keep in mind what we learned before, that the engine idling speed is actually enough to get you moving, we can try this. And this is what I would recommend newbies to try, what I would recommend you to teach anyone who's learning. That is to give it no gas, and then really slowly ease off the clutch until you start to feel the bike inch forward. So hold the clutch there, and once the bike gets going, then you can let the clutch go, and now you're rolling around on the engine idling speed without stalling the bike. So ride around for a bit and then pull in the clutch and then brake. we have to pull in the clutch before braking, because as we talked about before, if we stop the bike, if the rear wheel stops, the whole engine will stop, and that's the bike stalling. So if we pull in the clutch, the rear wheel and the engine would be disconnected, so the engine can keep running while the bike is stopped. So keep repeating this. This is teaching you to find that point at which the clutch starts to engage. So once you have that down in your muscle memory, you can ride a bike without stalling ever. So when you have that down, you can do the same thing, but now introduce a bit of gas at the start, and that is basically how you take off on a motorcycle without stalling. So there you go. So I hope this helps. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.